Welcome to the Pearson Center webinar number 32 since the start of the pandemic. A conversation today on the US election and how it affects Canada. My name is Andrew Cardozo and I'm president of the Pearson Center. As many of you will know, the Pearson Center is a progressive think tank, and our ongoing project this year is called COVID and Beyond, recognizing that we have a lot of issues to address as we plan for the recovery and rebuilding that is proving to be slow and long. This is an important time to build back better, to reimagine Canada and think big. Just briefly on the format for this evening, I want to tell you that we have a panel discussion that will last about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for Q&A with you, the audience. So please send in your questions using the question box during the hour. We will end promptly at 9 p.m. I want to take a moment to acknowledge two important sustaining sponsors who have made these webinars possible. They are the Canada's Building Trades Unions and the Canadian Association of Firefighters. Thank you for your support. We have an amazing panel today to address that US election and Canada. I will do very brief intros, just highlighting some of the issues that are relevant to today's discussion. Maryscott Greenwood, known as Scotty, is president of the Canadian American Business Council, the leading binational business organization that fosters interaction between the private and public sectors in both countries. A former American diplomat, she spent 4 years as chief of staff at the US Embassy in Canada, having been appointed to that position in 2001 by President Bill Clinton. Notably, during this period, she received the State Department's Meritorious Honor Award for Innovative Outreach Program to US governors and Canadian premiers to foster cooperation on issues of mutual concern. Certainly a model that was used very much in the lead up to the renegotiation of NAFTA. She's also a partner at Crestview Strategy. Professor Mugambi Jouet is author of Exceptional America: What Divides Americans from the World and from Each Other. He teaches law at McGill University, Faculty of Law. Before joining McGill in 2018, he taught at Stanford Law School in California. He's a member of the New York Bar, where he previously represented many indigent prisoners in homicide cases and the war on drugs in Manhattan and the Bronx. He studied law at Northwestern University in Chicago and received his PhD at Université Paris, La Sorbonne. Professor Melissa Haussman is a professor of political science at Carleton University. She specializes in US politics and comparative politics of Canada and the US, and in comparative gendered politics of reproductive healthcare. She received her PhD at Duke University in North Carolina and taught at Clark University and Suffolk University in Massachusetts before joining Carleton. Rob Oliphant is member of Parliament for Don Valley West. He's parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and is a member of the House of Commons Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Trade. You may be aware that he is an ordained minister in the United Church of Canada and has served congregations across the country. He earned his doctorate from the Chicago Theological Seminary at the University of Chicago in 2008. And Rob, you will forgive me if I say this. If anyone today speaks alternative facts by mistake, they will be able to get divine dispensation from Reverend Oliphant at the end of the session. I'm moderating our panel today. I'm delighted to tell you, backed by popular demand, is Brian Gallant, a member of the Pearson Center Advisory Board. You will know that he's the 33rd Premier of New Brunswick, where he interacted extensively with American federal and state governments and the business sector. He's currently CEO of the Canadian Centre for the Purpose of the Corporation at Navigator Limited. Monsieur Gallant, la parole est à vous.
Merci beaucoup, Andrew. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Nous vous remercions mille et une fois pour votre présence ici ce soir. We are very, very lucky to have wonderful panelists and, of course, a very interesting and fascinating topic. As was mentioned, you can put your questions and comments in the question box. We'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. I would say around the 40-minute mark on the hour, we'll make sure to try to start to go through them. And if needed, we'll do a lightning round. I'm sure the panelists are all ready and keen to answer your questions. We really have, as you know, for those who have watched before, a format where we want a free-flowing conversation, but we have some questions, of course, to get things started. And we have wonderful panelists, and 4 of them, so we're going to try to go maybe 1 answer per question. But I certainly told, and I'll repeat now, that the panelists can chime in at any point if they want to add something else to what was said. So let's dive right into it because we certainly have lots to talk about. So the first question will go to Melissa. Melissa, given the results of the Senate, the House, and the presidency, who are the winners and who are the losers of the U.S. election? Normally we ask that question metaphorically. In this case, we may have to sort of answer it literally first, but we'd be very curious as to what your sense is of who can say that they've won, who could feel like they've lost after the results were in.
Well, I think we know who feels they've lost. They're the ones filing the court challenges and conducting a huge march from Texas to Washington, apparently on Saturday. I would say that the forces of progressivism feel like we won, being a voting American myself. Clearly, Biden got a lot more votes, somewhere between 4 and 5 million right now. But the aggregating effects of the Electoral College make that really sort of hard to tease out in terms of the winner-take-all votes in the states. It was a slightly increased percentage of women, number of women in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. The numbers for women of color in the House have gone up slightly to 48, but the numbers of women of color in the Senate are the same, and it may actually go down depending on who takes Kamala Harris's place later. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Tell me, Mugambi, from your point of view, what's next? How is this all going to unfold from now until January 20th? Normally, we would sort of see the same type of process. Maybe that will be the case, and if so, please touch upon it. But will we see anything different given the sort of aftermath of the election? And if President Trump does, in fact, concede, what will that bring? And if he tries to hang on and continues what he's been doing over the last few days, what could that look like?
Well, Donald Trump has prepared us to be ready for the unexpected. He's dramatically changed our perspective of what was possible politically and changed the norms of American government. So far, he's refused to concede. And the issue is how far the Republican Party and Republican officials will support Trump in his denial of the results of the election. It does not appear to most election experts that he has a good shot of winning in the courts and changing the outcome of the election. But what we're looking at is potentially him fighting the outcome till the very end and also convincing a large part of American society that this was an election that was stolen and that Biden, if he takes office, is an illegitimate president. That has major implications in that it would perhaps exacerbate the tremendous polarization of American society, or at least preserve the status quo. My sense is that the polarization of America will remain steadfast for the upcoming years because the root causes of polarization, namely competing understandings of facts, of the role of government, of religion, of abortion, race, immigration, and beyond, are not going anywhere in the foreseeable future, although there were periods in American history when the country was much less polarized. That gives us
very interesting, and thank you for the insight. Rob, over to you. What will a Biden-Harris administration mean for Canada and U.S. relations, which I'm sure is sort of the bottom line of a lot of people that are tuning in tonight?
Absolutely, Brian, and just building on what last two had said, I grew up in a family that watched election results like other people watch the Stanley Cup or the World Series. That's the kind of family I grew up in. So I'm not going to diminish that Canadians, just like Americans, weren't enthralled watching the results come in. And the cliffhanger nature of it was interesting. But what I don't want to diminish that. I also don't want to overestimate the differences that will cause, because Canadian government, successive governments, have had to deal with successive American governments and have done so very well over the last several generations. The reality is we have far more in common than we have apart. And when governments get into place, it is hard to change things that quickly. So the reality is, as we have shown over the last 4 years, we've dealt with unexpected issues. We've dealt with the challenge to NAFTA. We've dealt with a change, sort of look at the world, and we've done it. And as we look at the next 4 years with President-elect Biden, I think we're seeing that there will be challenges and there will be opportunities. And the goal of the Canadian government is to seize the opportunities and manage the challenges. We're lucky in that as Vice President and as Senator, Joe Biden knows Canada. He's been here a number of times. He has an understanding of the geography of the continent. And we have a Vice President-elect who's lived here. So that has to help us. And I think that there's a sense of hopefulness about that. The Trump administration presented challenges, but also we showed that Congress is important, that both the House of Representatives and the Senate are very important for us to have rich relationships with. It's important to have relationships with governors, not only the border state governors, but all governors, and to have labor unions that know each other and businesses that know each other. And so I'm hopeful that these challenges of any administration will be put aside, and we're looking forward to it. I think the Prime Minister has been very clear in his congratulatory note that he's excited about the opportunities that lie ahead, and we will continue to do that.
Fantastic, Rob. Thank you. Scotty, over to you. We very curious to your reaction and what you think is the business community in Canada's reaction to the election, and maybe, if you don't mind, a little bit of the overall results, the Senate, the House, the presidency. So from your point of view, what are businesses feeling? What are businesses thinking after the results of the election?
Well, thanks so much, Brian, and it's really great to be with all of you. I think the business reaction is a sigh of relief, right? And it's not because business is necessarily partisan. They try not to be. Business, like diplomats, have to deal with whoever is elected by the people. But you know, there is a sigh of relief in that we know the outcome of the election now, and we know the direction. And I also think there's a sense that the big progressive agenda that Vice President-elect Joe Biden articulated was massive, and there are certain business opportunities in what he articulated, but there are also some concerns about what, you know, like the tax structure and all of that. I'm talking about the United States for a moment. But because the Senate will either flip to Democratic control or remain Republican, but either way, and we'll know that in a runoff in Georgia in January. But because it will be closely divided, and because the power is divided between the White House and the Congress, that serves to be a major moderating factor in what any president can do. So I think the business community looks at that and says, okay, we're not going to have a pendulum swing, extreme right to extreme left. Joe Biden is going to play it right up the center because that's who he is, and that's what he has to do given his dance partners in the United States. So I think in Canada, there is a sigh of relief that there will be a return to decorum. I think there's a sense that we won't get into these punitive tariffs back and forth that has characterized bilateral trade policy over the last 3.5 years under the Trump administration. And so these are all good things, and we'll see what opportunities are there. The other thing I would just say, and this is something that we're working on, is trying to make sure that both in Canada and in the United States, we resist the urge to turn inward. and to just say we can go it alone. You know, in Canada, you know, I think there's a sense of we don't want to have to be dependent on the U.S. for our personal protective equipment or things like that. And the truth is, we really are dependent on each other. We're really integrated with each other from a business point of view and from a, you know, societal point of view. And so, you know, I think businesses are going to help reinforce that message that we're in this together. We've got to get through this god-awful health situation we're in, and then we've got to get through the economic recovery together. And that's those are the conversations that I'm having with CEOs and business leaders on both sides of the border, Brian.
Well, glad to hear it. It's always good to hear that the business community is feeling a little bit of an uptick of morale. That's great. So the next question, we're going to go to Mugambi and Melissa, because I'd be curious from both of your perspectives to the answer of this question. So starting at least in 2016, maybe before, but at least from my point of view, it seems to have been really the catalyst, the point that we saw the catalyst of a type of change within the electorate. The US presidential election in 2016 was interesting to say the least. What's happening with the U.S. electorate? What's going on that Mugambi, to the point that you made earlier on, that you can have somebody like Donald Trump doing things quite differently? So what's happening with the electorate to allow that to happen and to have the sort of maybe abnormal type of behavior and presidency that we've seen with Donald Trump?
To understand Trump's election, we must go much farther into the past and understand the root causes of America's polarization. In the last 3 or 4 decades, there has been a phenomenon that political scientists have called asymmetric polarization, namely that the Republican Party in the United States has moved far more to the right than the Democratic Party has moved to the left on many issues. And this gradual radicalization of the Republican Party culminated in the election of Donald Trump. But to understand this, we also have to look at dimensions of American exceptionalism, which is the notion that America is an exception, for better or worse, compared to other Western democracies. And there are a whole host of issues that are far more divisive in America than in Canada, Europe, or elsewhere in the West, or elsewhere in the wider world. And these help explain why America is so divided right now, and why Trump was elected, and why American government is so dysfunctional, because there are many more sources and forces of polarization, which make issues like healthcare, which is not controversial elsewhere in the industrialized world, or guns or abortion, dramatically more divisive in America than in practically all other developed nations.
It's fascinating, and to your point, something that has probably been building up and just manifested itself in 2016 and probably to some extent in the last few days as well. Melissa, over to you. Very curious as to what your perspective would be.
I would agree. Seeds of 2016 were very long-term, and one of the structural issues we need to note is the weird little factor that in the U.S., the state legislatures draw the House districts. And so, you know, the vast majority of state legislatures and governorships have been Republican since 2000. This was then played out in 2010 when the Republicans adopted the red map strategy. And now, I mean, Democrats thought that they were going to win a majority, or not majority, but that they were going to retake some key state legislatures in this past election. Didn't happen, which actually puts Democrats in a rather weak position for the next, well, certainly for the midterm, because the 2022 election will be the first one where we see the effects of the redistricting. We don't have large enough Democratic, you know, majorities or minorities in some of those states to really impact. I mean, there were a couple of states where there was a significant enough percentage elected to stop governors from vetoing, but still it's not enough. The other thing is that in some of the very famous feminist political scientists who research the role of the gender gap, basically, and Kathleen Dolan from University of Wisconsin is one of them, who basically says that the gender gap is actually affected more by men, and it's not really by usually the issues that are thought to be women's issues. It's about the size of the welfare state, the market and economy. And I would just say, I guess I disagree slightly with my colleague, Professor Jouet. I'd say that a lot of these issues are equally contentious in Europe. For example, I happen to be writing a book about Theresa May and Brexit. And so we know that immigration and the politics of, I guess we could say, false issues, where a valence issue stands in for an economic issue or something like that, is used equally in the US as well as in Europe. Some of the Trump voters from 2016 were strong Trump voters again, the lower educated, particularly white women and white men. Latinos and African Americans did not go to Biden in as big numbers as they actually did before Obama. So there's a lot of fascinating stuff to look at in terms of who turned out to vote for whom. And yes, and the issue of issues, polarization was enormous. Like, name any issue, and 90% of the people who voted for Biden said, yeah, COVID has been handled terribly. 90% of the people who voted for Trump say, no, it was fine. So there's enormous polarization as reflected by the institutions.
Well, Brian, can I just jump in on those two observations for a second?
Absolutely, yes, please do.
Just lest we be filled with doom and gloom about the U.S. and the trends. I just want to, and I'd be interested in the colleagues' reaction. But you look at the state of Georgia. I came up politically in Georgia and lived there and worked in politics in 1992, which is the last time a Democrat won. We also had a Senate runoff that year. Democrats lost the runoff, but won the presidency. And what I would say is Georgia went for Joe Biden this time, or they went against Donald Trump this time. Trump was repudiated in the state of Georgia. That's dramatic. And in 2 years, I think we'll see Stacey Abrams mount her second run for governor. And I think her chances, if I had to guess today, are quite good. She had a very close run for governor a couple of years ago, and when she didn't win, she went to work. And so people in Georgia, Democrats in Georgia, and progressives in Georgia haven't had this kind of success in a long time. And so I think that bodes well not only for Georgia, but for places like Texas and other places that haven't seen Democratic leadership in a while. So anyway, I'm not disagreeing at all with anything that's been said. I just wanted to give one little glimmer of hope that there are some trends that are from a progressive point of view, sort of positive.
Well, Scotty, it's 9:30 p.m.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, most people are in fact saying that Stacey Abrams and her network was the cause of a lot of the Democratic transitional votes in Georgia.
That's
Texas,
right.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about progressivism there, but yeah, sorry.
Oh, that was fantastic. Great conversation. Scotty, I just want to say it's 9:30 p.m. here in Shediac Bridge, New Brunswick. So I'm going to go to bed right after this webinar. So a little hope before I go to bed is fantastic. Rob, everybody has made some interesting comments, and I'm going to sort of pull some of them together to ask a question of you. And the question is quite simple. Is the federal government here in Canada going to change its strategy at all, its approach at all? Should it change, or should it just basically stay the same? And pulling from the comments, it's just fascinating, probably quite complex for the government, where you have polarization, as Mugambi was talking about. You have, as was pointed out as well, the states seem to be leaning towards the Republicans. You have a Congress that is going to potentially moderate the Biden-Harris administration, as was pointed out by both Melissa and Scotty. So with that in mind, does the approach stay the same? Do you have to change it? And if so, what does it look like?
I want to start by saying, politicians, we usually like to talk. I'm finding actually Melissa, Scotty, and Mugambi far more interesting than a politician. So that's where I'm starting. In reflecting on where we're at, there's a couple of things that are in my head. One is that the last 3.5, 4 years have changed the way we approach the United States. We've had to do things differently. At one point during NAFTA, we counted out, and one of my jobs as Parliamentary Secretary was to be watching, the way we were sending MPs and senators and committees and groups to fan out. There were 276 encounters at one point of MPs and senators meeting their counterparts. It wasn't left to an administration, to an executive kind of level. We had to get down and get into knowing each other better. I think that was new. It was not radically different, but we had changed. I don't think we'll go back now. And I think what we've learned is that the complexities of our world, whether it's COVID-19, the health crisis of that, or the economic crisis of it, climate change, and the continent we share, business being robust, and between our two economies being critical for, it's actually critical that we keep reminding Americans that we're their best customer, and that in state after state after state, region after region, they need us and want us. So we're going to do that, but I think we've tweaked the way we do it already. And I don't think we'll go back on that. I think we are going to have a robust approach. What I think Canada will do, whether it's on a trade issue, whether it's on a climate issue, is we'll try to bring facts to the table. And we're hopeful that those facts will be heard and those facts will be added to the mix of decision making. So I think that's going to be an important approach we do. But the other thing I would say is we have a minority government in Canada, and when you've got a House or a Congress and a president that are of different parties, if that is what ends up happening, it's a little bit like having a minority Westminster system. You have to be big. You have to spread out and do a lot of activities because politics is unpredictable. So I think our approach will be much the same as it's been, but it'll be better than it was 10 years ago. I think we've recognized that. The last point I would put out is that the bilateral relationship is critical, of course, but the US role in the world is something that Canada values. It is something that we need to be multilateralists in Canada. Very few things we can do on our own. So we draw in Commonwealth partners, we draw in La Francophonie, we count on leadership from the US. And as we look at these next 4 years, I see very rich opportunities to build on things like COVID-19 or climate change. I'm excited about it.
Well, that's good. Hope, excitement, this is good. For this late in Atlantic Canada, I'm certainly feeling it. So we have some phenomenal questions coming from the crowd. So we're going to dive into a few, if you don't mind. We're still going to try to divvy it up, so I apologize if I don't give it to the right person, but I'm sure you'll all do very well. Mugambi, we'll start with you if it's okay. We have an interesting question here. Conservative politics have been changed since Trump became president, even in Canada, this audience member believes. What do you see happening to conservative politics after Trump?
I'm not sure I agree with the premise that there's been a big change in American conservative politics since Trump. I would say that the evolution of the Republican Party since the Reagan Revolution has enabled the rise of Donald Trump, with the growing radicalization of the party. If you look at the following example, if on September 10th, 2001, the US president had claimed that he could detain anyone forever incommunicado if that person were accused of terrorism, and could also torture them, people would have said that that was totally unfathomable in American society. Yet this is the position that George W. Bush adopted with the support of a sizable segment of conservative America. And that reflects how the erosion of norms in American society and the challenges to democratic principles have much longer roots. It did not start with Donald Trump or even with George W. Bush. And therefore, when you look at the situation in the US, it did not start with Trump. It may not end with him. And also, I would say that the situation in Canada is quite different, just like it is different in other parts of the Western world, because there are more sources and forces of polarization in the United States. I agree with Professor Haussman's prior comment that there is also strong division in Europe over questions like immigration that help precipitate Brexit. But there's just far more issues that Donald Trump has been able to harp on, such as abortion, which is much more divisive in America. There's a much more prominent subculture of anti-intellectualism in American society that has facilitated the spread of disinformation. If you look at the question of race, it's much more divisive in American history, partly because America has historically been the Western democracy with by far the highest share of racial and ethnic minorities. Guns are very divisive in America, the highest number of guns per capita in the world, the highest incarceration rate in the world as well, the only Western democracy to still have the death penalty. There are many more bases for polarization in America, and that's why conservatism in Canada or Western Europe, by and large, is very different, and that's why Trumpism may not come to other parts of the West, at least in the foreseeable future.
Well, thank you for that, Mugambi. Melissa, we'll go over to you. Here's an interesting question from an audience member. Canada has adopted a lot of policies that even some Democrats would consider socialist, but they work here as in Canada. Do U.S. Democrats look to Canada for policy? And I will add to that, should the U.S. Democrats be looking to Canada for policy?
I'll answer that, but I just have to add that the Conservatives elected 45 anti-abortion MPs in 2019. So I would politely disagree that abortion is any less of an issue in Canada than it is in the United States. I can't think of one single socialist policy that Canada has. I know it's a nice little trope that US conservatives like to use. And as I say to my classes, Biden doesn't have a socialist bone in his body. I mean, I know that people talked about, the national energy policy of decades ago as being quote unquote socialist, but sure, Democrats have lots to learn from Canadian policies. I mean, policies of inclusion and tolerance and diversity. Also, of course, party support of women. And yeah, having, very high profile women in the government, in the cabinet, those sorts of things are all great. So, but in terms of socialism, I just don't see it as a strong force in either country, to be honest.
Okay, fair enough. Interesting. This is good. We're having some constructive debate amongst the panelists. We're not always accepting the premise of the questions from the audience, but this is good. This is exactly what the Pearson Center wants. Scotty, over to you. And this is a question from the audience, and they write, the president has damaged so many relationships with allies of the U.S., including Canada. This is obviously coming from the audience member. What is the first thing that needs to be done to mend these relationships, especially here in Canada?
Well, I accept the premise of that particular question, and I would say that the first move, besides the president-elect having this return to decorum, the first move was made by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He immediately congratulated the vice president-elect. He wanted to be first. Ireland beat him to the punch by just a little bit on Twitter, but the first foreign phone call that the vice president-elect received was willing to take was from Prime Minister Trudeau. And so there is a real opening there. And I just think that recognizing that we have to work together to rebuild some of the global institutions that help things function, like the World Health Organization, like the World Trade Organization, some of the, giving confidence to the NATO alliance that we really are there for each other, and we're not going to hold the alliance up hostage, God forbid, for level of dues that people pay, although everybody needs to pay their fair share. So I think those kind of conversations are very beneficial and will serve to repair not only the bilateral relationship as between Canada and the United States, but also the way we take on world challenges together, because there are some big ones out there, and it is much better for us to lock arms and take on the world than it is for us to be looking at each other and figuring out how to best each other.
Very interesting, Scotty. Both yourself and Rob have now mentioned the multilateralism and multilateral organization. So maybe Rob, what would we like to see here in Canada if we were to really sort of ask, even strongly encourage the Biden-Harris administration in terms of what organizations we need them to step up on right away, what maybe international agreements would we want to see them act on? So talk to us a little bit about what we would want, what the federal government will want to try to push with the Biden-Harris administration to have them be in lockstep a little bit more with Canada than maybe has been the case for the last 4 years.
I think the reality is that we have been promoting some ideas around the world trade, the whole trade regime, and we have an Ottawa group that is trying to reform world trade. And I think that the United States should be part of that. I think that finding a way to bring the best out of everybody's economy, we will all do better in our world if we can do that. I think obviously we're looking forward to renewing partnership in the Paris Accord, and Mr. Biden has said that he clearly supports the Paris Accord, and I think that is a very important step for our whole planet. I think when it comes to COVID-19, the reality is, I have said this for years, and that's kind of the clergy in me saying that no one is okay until everyone's okay. But when you get to a pandemic, it's particularly important because until a virus is eradicated everywhere, it's not eradicated anywhere. So we all become susceptible to illness. And that goes the same with our economic recovery. So we'll be looking for partnership with the United States to help us in the poorest countries of the world, whether it's small island states that have had huge downfalls in their revenue because of tourism and because of remittances and those things, whether it's the international financial institutions trying to find ways to build back better, whether that's in countries that may not have had as much exposure to the virus as we've had in the Western countries, but the economic impact is huge. And so I think we'll be looking for partnerships in that. Our multilateral systems are lumpy. They don't work easily or well. At times they're imperfect, as we are imperfect. But we count on the G7 and the G20 to provide leadership, and having the United States as core to that leadership is critical to everyone's well-being. And there's also, I could get into military alliances such as NATO, but other operations where we're countering terrorism, say in Syria, where we're trying to build stability in Afghanistan, all of those parts of our world where we want peace and dignity and food and health, we need to be there. And it's not going to be magic. It's not going to be overnight. But I think that we will continue to help with that, and I'm hopeful.
Hey, Brian, if I could just piggyback on that for just a moment. I think I agree with the sentiment entirely about needing to be there for the world and helping. But as the two former U.S. UN ambassadors who I'm friends with and done programs with that you would think would be opposites actually have the same view. Samantha Power, who I was just speaking with, and Kelly Craft. So Obama's U.S. UN and Trump's U.S. UN both talk about how the U.S. is the largest donor to the UN. And the second largest is China. China is putting a lot of money behind its global ambitions. And so it's going to be important for countries like Canada, if I might say it, and other countries around the world to lead not only with moral authority and with good desires and sort of the right ideas, but also to get in there with resources, because you can't just leave it up to the U.S. and China. You know, if you want to have an impact, it's going to be important to step up in a very serious way wherever you decide to do so with money, and that's expensive. I mean, convincing Americans that it makes sense to spend money on, you know, foreign projects is difficult, and it's not all that different, I would posit, in Canada.
If I may jump in.
Yeah, of course, Mugambi, go ahead.
The entire world, of course, is watching what's happening in the United States. What is striking is that international opinion overwhelmingly favored Biden over Trump. But if you look back in the prior election, so was Hillary Clinton strongly favored by public opinion in Canada and abroad, and so was Barack Obama strongly supported over Mitt Romney and John McCain in the prior elections. So that shows how what I mentioned before, that conservative America is largely an outlier in the modern Western world, given that conservatives and liberals in other Western democracies tend to identify much more with the US Democratic Party than with the Republican Party. And another thing to add with regard to the longer view, of course, Trump has challenged the European Union and called for its dismantlement, and he's also called into question US alliances and praised dictators like Vladimir Putin. And that raises, of course, questions about the US leadership in the world. And that's a recurrent question. That's not often mentioned, but during the presidency of George W. Bush, we tend to forget that there were often calls for the US to reaffirm its role as a leader in democracy and human rights. And so was the case also during the Vietnam War. So who knows what the future will bring, but it seems to be a recurrent issue for America in its relationship to the wider world.
Great additions. Thank you, Mugambi and Scotty. I'm going to go to you, Melissa, but I actually want to hear from Mugambi and Scotty on this question as well, because Rob sort of touched upon, not in this context, but I think touched upon some things that he would like to see from the administration, such as obviously the Paris Accord, which is I'm not supposed to participate, but that's certainly something that I'm hopeful, which seems to be the word of this webinar. So I'm hopeful will be the case. What would you, Melissa, and then I'll go to Scotty and Mugambi as well. What signals would you like to see from the Biden-Harris administration, whether it be in the transition or in the early days of their administration? What would be some of the key things you would like to see them speak to, or even more importantly, take action on? Melissa.
In terms of Canada, or just in general?
In general, obviously, I'm sure a lot of people are wondering the impact it would have on Canada, but the world is important to Canada too. So really anything that you deem important.
Right. Well, I mean, there are a couple of, I guess, thorny issues going on domestically, and of course, regarding Canada. We know that the Prime Minister phoned Nancy Pelosi as well, and I think they had a really good discussion. But also, of course, there's anxiety about energy and, you know, the pipelines, because you can't really campaign as a climate change guy and then support the pipelines. So that's going to be an issue. I think some people are saying there's going to be pressure within Congress from the squad in terms of, well, issues regarding race, issues regarding inequality, and of course the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So again, not directly pulling in Canada, but the US as a world leader and having to deal with its internal conflicts.
Thank you for that, Melissa. Scotty, over to you.
So what I'd like to see from the Biden-Harris administration is, other than addressing the pandemic in a very serious way, which is incredibly important, obviously, they've got to save the economy. Joe Biden thinks of his model as FDR. He went to Warm Springs, Georgia, late in the campaign, and so I want him to have a big, bold agenda. I don't want him to tamp down all of the things, all of the tools at the U.S. government's disposal to to save the economy. I think that's going to be really important for the US, for Canada, and for the world. I just want to differ a little bit from Melissa in one thing, though. This notion that you quote can't campaign as a climate guy and then support pipelines. I think what Joe Biden did very well in this campaign is talk clearly and directly about how important his commitment is to sustainability and to a transition to a low carbon future. But he also didn't say he's against all fracking. Right, so he understands that hydraulic fracturing is a technology that is used, in this transition. So I think there's a way to thread the needle. We also know that, safe modern pipelines are a transportation system where you can make real progress as long as you're still on oil and gas, which we are for some time, is in the development of those resources and in the use of those resources. So it's, from the planet's point of view, pipelines don't hurt the planet. It's how you extract the resource, how you process it, how you use it, and what your transition plan looks like. So anyway, I think Joe Biden, as the radical moderate that he is, will be able to make a lot of progress on environmental issues, meaningful progress. He'll be able to undo some of the more challenging regulations that Trump put into place, and Biden will be able to reverse those immediately by executive order. And by the way, I'll just say that a number of the moves that Trump made on environmental policy with respect to the fossil fuel industry were not welcomed by the fossil fuel industry. Coal is not back. He didn't save coal. Utilities are transitioning away from coal and into renewables. And that is something that happened over the last 4 years. So anyway, I think there's a lot that can be done to save the economy, do it in a sustainable way. But you got to deal with the pandemic first.
If I could just jump in. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say Biden's life will be a lot easier if there were a Democratic Senate, which I'm not so sure of, but we'll see.
I think it would be harder. I think the bar goes way up if the Senate's Democratic. Sorry, we're getting into the first affirmative rebuttal here, Brian, but if the Senate goes Democratic in Georgia on January 5th, then the progressives, so then Biden will run the table. You'd have a Democratic House, Democratic Senate, Biden and Harris in the White House, and the progressive movement will say, okay, let's do everything while we can. Let's strike while the iron's hot. And now, of course, what we know is the Senate could be Democratic, but you still have Republicans you got to play ball with. And it will be harder for him, I think, for Biden, because expectations go through the roof. Anyway.
I don't know. It's all about Mitch McConnell for me.
Fantastic conversation. Is great. So Mugambi, same question that I had a few moments ago. If you could sort of pick a thing or two that you would really like to see the Biden-Harris administration signal to or action, what would it be?
Well, with regard to climate change, my concern is that a Biden-Harris administration would face two major problems. First, climate change is a much more controversial issue in the US and other Western democracies because in places like Canada or Western Europe, the divide is often about what to do about climate change. In the US, there's a more fundamental divide over whether climate change is even a fact, whether it's a myth or a hoax. And in my book, I document a lot of declarations by Republican leaders in the run-up to Trump's election, claiming that climate change is a total myth fabricated by know-it-all scientists. There's more recognition of climate change among Republicans in recent years, but this suggests that there will be a lot of pushback from Republicans toward whatever Biden would propose. And the second obstacle for the Biden and Harris presidency and vice presidency would be that the US is the Western democracy where lobbying by moneyed interests has the most clout, and the polluting industries will strongly resist whatever environmental measures would be implemented or proposed by the US federal government. And that's why there's often a big discrepancy between what Democrats support as a matter of rhetoric, saying fighting climate change, and what they do in practice, lobbying plays a big role in that.
Thank you for that, Mugambi. So conscious of time, we're going to get to the lightning round here. So Rob, I'm going to go to you because I have a question that I'm really curious and I want to give you this opportunity. I think it's important. So to premiers, provinces, territories, to mayors, to cities, to other subnationals, to the business community, to labor, to whatever other group, what message would you have to them on how they can help ensure that we strengthen the relationship between Canada and the U.S. Given the Biden-Harris administration?
I'll weigh in on that. It's I live in Midtown Toronto, but I grew up in Sault Ste. Marie, and Sault Ste. Marie is a border city between Ontario, Northern Ontario, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And as a kid, every day I watched trucks go across the International Bridge, back and forth, taking materials from both our sides, and to recognize our provincial leaders, our municipal leaders, our business leaders, our union leaders need to recognize that while we do look to Asia, while we do look to Europe, while we are expanding our trade horizons, we are totally interdependent with the American economy. And what is good for business in one will be good for business in the other. And we're going to have to find a way to help the Americans understand again and again that we're their biggest and best customer. That, you know, before COVID-19, $2 billion a day going across that border, two-way traffic every day. Finding ways to get to COVID-19, we couldn't have done it without cooperation between our two countries. I think that what I would talk to governors about and provincial premiers and territorial leaders would be that sense that this can be win-win. Not a zero-sum game, it's a win-win game to recognize that we need each other, we're each other's best markets, and we'll continue to do that. And then together with Mexico, obviously in our integrated trade, we can compete in the world. And I think that that message of going alone is not going to work in either country, and we do that. And that's what Scotty does every day of our life. To remind business leaders of that. I've seen our committee do that, and it's something that we all need to take on and say, we're not enemies in this continent. We're friends, and we may have differences, but let's get to work.
Fantastic. This is a long question, so I'm going to go really quickly. Mugambi and Melissa, maybe 30 seconds each. I'd like the two of you to talk to this one. And this is the question sort of word for word. Many people assume that Trump's toxic rhetoric would doom him with minority groups, but he seems to have done much better than expected with them, especially certain Latino communities in Florida and Texas. Are left and center-left parties in the US and Canada too complacent about certain support? And do they particularly risk alienating them in the current environment, which seems to emphasize identity politics on the left as much as on the right? So Mugambi, we'll go to you first. 30 seconds if you can. Melissa, to you after that.
The notion that Trump has made a lot of headway with minorities is overstated. Minorities tend to overwhelmingly support the Democratic Party, and they have for a very long time. It's not just the black vote, but also Asian Americans and Latinx people tend to support the Democrats. So here, the bottom line is that the Trump administration has drawn much closer to white nationalism than anyone would have expected, and has supported a xenophobic agenda. And that is perhaps what is radicalizing people on the other side of the spectrum, at least as part of a vicious circle, insofar as identity politics may play a role in the polarization of American society.
Thank you, Mugambi. Melissa?
No, I don't think the Democrats or the center-left parties, liberals, I don't think anybody's complacent. Again, yes, minorities, racial minorities do often favor the Democratic Party, but by a lower margin this time around. And if you've seen some of the ads that got played in Miami where Biden was called a Chavista, And we know there was, clear appeal to the Venezuelan and Cubano expatriate communities. But what's bizarre is Miami elected a woman Democratic mayor. So, all this stuff about getting, these voters to vote for Trump, but then on the other hand, a woman Democratic mayor of Miami. So go figure. It's very mixed, and we'll be teasing it out for a long time.
Brian, can I add 2 words?
Of course.
Kamala Harris. And the reality is, I was out the other day and I saw a little girl, a little person of color, look at her mother and say, "Is she the president?" Meaning Kamala Harris. And her mother said, "Not yet." And just for that to happen on our continent has to tell us there is something going on. And we can talk about identity politics, we can talk about divide, but there's something there. And I don't want to put the weight of perfection on her shoulders. She doesn't have to be perfect, but just being in that office is going to make a difference.
Fantastic.
From my notes from Foreign Affairs.
Andrew's not going to like this, but I want to ask Scotty one last question, and I know she can do it succinctly. What is the future for Trump? Will he run again? Will he still have a stronghold on the Republican Party? I'm curious, Scotty, as I know you know the system quite well. So what do you think?
Don't know about the future for Trump himself. I think he wants to start an online media network to go after Fox, which is sort of ironic. But the future of Trump politics and Trumpism, I think that, who will run for president in 4 years? Will it be one of his kids, somebody with the last name of Trump, or will it be a reaction against Trump in the Republican Party? Will it be a Tom Cotton, Nikki Haley, Ben Sass, or somebody like that? And there will be a battle inside the Republican Party like you have never seen, because Trump is awfully influential still. But it'll also depend, I keep coming back to it, on what happens in Georgia, what happens in the Senate. If Melissa's best buddy Mitch McConnell gets to be majority leader or minority leader, it's still a powerful role. And so that will depend, that will have a lot to do with the two. If I could also just add one quick parting shot here. Rob talked about how all of the work that's been done with U.S. governors and mayors and all of that, and it's all true, and we've got to keep doing that. And I will tell you, just my organization, Canadian American Business Council, is getting together next Wednesday, November 18th. Everybody should come, free, open to the public, State of the Relationship. But my point here is, we have been inviting a lot of U.S. politicians and Canadians and notables to come and appear and be part of it. And in the U.S., it's like pushing on an open door. It used to be you had to explain why Canada is relevant to them, even though it should be obvious. And now we've got all sorts of notables from around the U.S. where all we did was send an email and immediately they said, yes, I'm in. And so that's a result of all of the hard work and the awareness building over the last few years. So there's nothing like a near-death experience to get you focused. And with the NAFTA and everything else and Trump, it's pretty bad, but a lot of work's been done, and I think that's a positive.
Thank you so much, Scotty. Andrew, over to you. Thank you for indulging us.
Well, thank you, Brian. That was a really fascinating discussion. These are such uncertain and changing times, and I think what all of you did today was really to inform us and educate us about the myriad factors at play, both within the United States, how they affect Canada, and how they affect the whole world. So we live in very exciting, changing times. Thank you for that. Thank you, Brian, for your wonderful moderating. Scotty, Greenwood, Professor Melissa Haussman, and Professor Mugambi Jouet, thank you for sharing your extensive insights on what's happening in America and how it affects us. And Rob Oliphant, a special thank you to you for being here. I'm sure there's much you will want to take back to your government colleagues from the discussion today. So thank you, all of us, for being here. And if anybody needs dispensation, I'm happy to share an email with your email with them. The same thing, if you can't go to sleep at night because you're worried about things, you need a calming voice of divine intervention. Rob can certainly help us with that. But I hope those days are over. Anyhow, to the audience, I just want to thank you for being here, for your questions, and tell you we've got a few webinars coming up in the remaining weeks of this calendar year. They will address issues such as this SHE session, isotopes as a growing sector in Canada and how they fit into the economic rebuilding, basic income, and healthcare. With that, please join us. Keep in touch with our website for information on those webinars, and certainly go to YouTube and see today's webinar and any of our past ones. With that, thank you, everyone. I'm just leaning back. Since the audience can't, since you can't hear the audience applause, I will ask each of us to applause for each other as we chime out. So.
Hey. Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Hey, Andrew.